Hello. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about the process of translating academic writing for wider audiences. And as you can probably guess, my name is Cara Jordan. I am the co-founder of Flatpage, which is an editorial agency and a publishing house. Currently, I'm based in Berlin, Germany. It's a little bit dark and rainy out tonight for me. But if you're interested and willing, please share where you're dialing in from and your interest in this topic in the chat. And I'll give you all a little bit more of a background on me. I started my career in academia as an art historian. And since 2021, I've been the head of operations here at Flatpage, where I run a team of about 50 editors. So we not only help scholars every day with shaping their texts, but since 2024, we've also been publishing them ourselves. We just published our second book, and it's called Gunocracy. It was written by a historian named Christopher Strain at Florida Atlantic University. And while writing this book, he faced the same issues that we're going to be talking about today. And I might bring up an example or two from the book to illustrate some of the points that I'm going to be talking about throughout today's presentation. And just for some brief housekeeping, today's presentation will be recorded, of course, as you just accepted. And we're going to upload the video to our channels in the coming week, so stay tuned about that. We do ask that you kindly stay muted and with your video turned off for the entirety of the presentation because it is recorded, and any questions can be posted in the chat or by direct message to my editorial manager, Ben Clifford, who's going to collect them for the Q&A after the talk. All right, so let's get down to it. Today, we're going to talk about what we in the industry call crossover texts. And today I'm going to be focusing on books. So I'll, mention books throughout, but the principles that I'm going to talk about also apply to other kinds of texts that you might be writing, essays, op-eds, and the like. So these are books, crossover books are published by scholars, and they perhaps started out as scholarly manuscripts, but they were written or reshaped for a non-academic audience. And you'll see the phrase translating academic writing on the slide. And what I mean by translation is not the simplification or dilution of our ideas. It really means changing the form of the book because its audience has changed. And when I say wider audiences here, I'm talking specifically about readers who are outside of the academy, who are intellectually curious but not evaluating the scholarly contribution of the work. This distinction is going to matter throughout this talk, and I'll touch on it in a couple of different points throughout. But really, I want to start here because this sentence is the premise of the entire talk today. Writing for wider audiences doesn't mean simplifying your ideas. It's about reshaping them for readers. So when scholars imagine writing for wider audiences, they often assume that the task is simplification or making the content easier, lighter, less serious. But the real work is in reshaping it, deciding what comes first, what can wait, how a reader encounter an idea for the first time. All of that is things that go into shaping a text for a wider or broader readership. This sentence isn't a judgment about the work, but it describes a different relationship to the reader. And that's the lens that we're going to be looking at as we review this topic today. Before getting into the anxieties about the scholarly rigor of crossover books, though, it's worth pausing on why this question matters at all. Many scholars want a broad readership because they want their ideas to what we call travel. They want it to matter beyond a classroom, beyond their subfields, or beyond like a network of citations or bibliographic entries that other people are citing in their own work. Perhaps they even see a practical utility for people outside of academia. And this desire is often connected to career stages or a sense that the stakes of the work exceed academic venues. An example of this is Chris Strain's book. he thought he had some useful suggestions for how people could solve the gun problem in the US because of his many, many years of research on the topic. And he wanted to share the results with the general public and policymakers in a way that was understandable and could have practical usage outside of the academy. So that was his motivation for wanting to write a book of this nature. If we don't name that motivation, the conversation gets stuck at the level of technique or writing style. But this is really about purpose. What do you want your work to do in the world, and who do you want it to reach? There needs to be a deeper purpose for why you want to create a new type of text for your book, because it does require quite a bit of effort to do. I will say, if you are on at the beginning parts of this journey, or if you've been trying to do it already, you know that it's difficult to do. In academia, we're taught to write for journals, university presses, and other types of gatekeepers. There are certain conventions that we use to signal these gatekeepers about our expertise and demonstrate our knowledge and our stake in the topic. And we'll go into depth about what those are in a minute. However, when we're writing for a general audience, we're eliminating these gatekeepers and specialist reviewers, and instead we're writing for curious readers, some of whom might be interested in our topic but have little or no prior knowledge. As you're going through this process, you might consider who your reader might be during this process. And for me personally, when I was trying to write for a more general audience, I oftentimes think about my mother as someone who might be reading it. She has a graduate degree, but she's not at the level of interest to read anyone's dissertation, mine included. I think she's never read it. But that doesn't mean she's not intellectually curious, and doesn't mean that she's not reading things all the time and having conversations about ideas. It just means that that level of specialist knowledge doesn't hold her attention. So how can we write in a way that might engage somebody like my mom or your imagined reader? So there's a worry that usually goes along with this premise, and it means that if reshaping isn't about simplification, then what happens to the rigor of our text? What happens to all those years of research, all those years of being in coursework and going to archives and all of that? Is it just going to disappear? And many people equate rigor with the density of the writing. So making things that are almost impossible to understand, or having a very large number of citations in your work, or even like having it be very difficult to read. But those are signals that are designed for academic readers. They're not signals that are meant for a broader readership. For books that are written for wider audiences, rigor shows up a bit differently. It shows up in the care that we take in our thinking, in the accuracy of our claims, and the responsibility that we take towards the reader. So we're really taking them into account as we're writing things. Popular doesn't mean casual. It doesn't mean making things light and funny. It means deliberate. Making the shift means that we have to change our point of view with relationship to the text and what we want our readers to get out of it. Of course, that's easier said than done. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. This is often attributed to Albert Einstein, whether it was or not, we don't know. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you can't say it simply, you don't understand it well enough, but you want to make things understandable to your audience. You don't want to alienate them in the way that many people do, not to say that you do, in their own academic writing. You want to make everything understandable for that wider audience. I want to slow down here a little bit because each of these bullets reflects those habits that scholars have learned for really good reasons, and how we can shift when we're writing for wider audiences. So let's start with the left-hand side of this slide under number 1. Defensive framing is the habit of anticipating objections before anyone has raised them. And in academic writing, this shows up as careful qualifications, hedging, and preemptive positioning against possible critics. And this makes sense when you're writing for evaluative readers like peer reviewers, whose job is to judge whether or not your claims hold up. But for general readers, this can feel like distance or uncertainty. before they've even understood what you're trying to say. Extensive signposting to outside literature is another deeply trained behavior. We've all done it. You're taught to show where you sit in relationship to existing debates, to acknowledge your knowledge predecessors or colleagues, and to demonstrate your awareness of the field. But in books for wider audiences, this kind of signposting often overwhelms readers who don't yet know why these debates matter. And sometimes they might not even care, and it might not even be relevant necessarily to the overall topic of the book. Delayed payoff is perhaps the most subtle habit. And in academic context, withholding the main claim until later in your text signals sophistication, we might say. But for non-evaluative readers, delayed payoff creates some friction. Readers want to know early on why they're here and what's at stake in the book, even if the full argument unfolds gradually over time. Now, in contrast, let's look at under bullet 2, what wider audiences expect. Orientation means helping the reader understand where they are and what kind of journey they're on. And this doesn't, again, mean oversimplifying. It means giving readers enough footing or context so that they can follow complex ideas without getting lost. So we don't want them to feel alienated here. Momentum is about movement through a text. Readers should feel that each section is carrying them somewhere, not circling or restarting. And momentum is often what distinguishes a book that people admire from a book that people actually finish. You want to tell a story that has a cadence and that holds readers' interest and attention throughout. And finally, early stakes. Wider audience readers want to know why something matters to them really early on in the text. Not in disciplinary terms, not using jargon, but in human, intellectual, or practical ones. So stakes create the reason why they continue to read the book or why they put it down and forget it. The gap between these two columns, 1 and 2, is not about quality. Again, it's not a judgment about the text. It's not about your intelligence or the intelligence that you put into the book or whether or not your ideas are good or bad. It's really about the purpose of the text. And much of what we do as editors and what you're going to do if you're writing and shaping the text is about helping you and helping the text to bridge that gap deliberately. So to transform something that uses these training methods and transform that into something that is more intelligible for a broader audience. Now, I speak from an editorial point of view, and before we got on this call, there's other editors here in the room, I'm sure, but let's talk about what editors see when they look at crossover drafts, because we see a lot of drafts, especially at Flatpage. Again, we work with a lot of authors who are coming to us with these kinds of book projects, not only for our editorial agency, but also we publish these kinds of books ourselves. So when we're early on in the process of conversion, we don't see books that have bad ideas. They all have good ideas. What we do is we want to help shape those academic conventions and help the reader to better understand your ideas. Some of the things that we see are chapters that still look like dissertation chapters or scholarly book contributions. The openings are dense to them. The stakes arrive late. The voice is careful to the point of being constrained. And these aren't flaws. Again, they're not flaws. They're just signs of where the work is coming from. So this is your baby it was born somewhere else. And now you want it to go out in the world and transform and have a broader impact. So I want to look at each one of these aspects in a little bit more detail so that we know what to avoid what to point out as we're editing and reshaping our own work or others' work. In academic writing, delaying the central argument is often a sign of seriousness. You build context, you establish a conversation, and only then do you reveal what your position is on them. In my own dissertation, it came all the way at the conclusion of the dissertation. It wasn't even spattered throughout, I have to say. But that approach really makes sense when readers are trained to be very patient and evaluative, or they literally have to read your work in order to retain their job as an academic. But for wider audiences, delayed argument creates uncertainty. Readers aren't sure what kind of book they're reading yet, why they should invest their time and their attention in it. They may admire the prose, but they don't yet have a reason to care. And that's why people put down books because they just it stops holding their attention. They stop caring. Editors who are working on trade-facing books often ask a simple question really early on in the process. What problem is this book helping the reader think through? That doesn't mean giving everything away on page one, but it does mean signaling stakes and direction early so that the reader knows that they're in capable hands. So you're going to be guiding them. The second barrier is about a shift in posture. Academic writing trains scholars to perform expertise, to show mastery of debates, sources, and intellectual lineages. We demonstrate that through the dissertation. In trade books, that performance often becomes an obstacle. Readers aren't asking you to prove that you belong. They assume you do, or they wouldn't have picked up the book in the first place. What they want is guidance. They want help understanding an issue, a history, or a way of seeing. Editorial work on this aspect means that we need to decide when demonstrating knowledge is actually advancing the reader's understanding of a text and when it simply reassures the author. So when it's just for the author's perspective. Subtraction here is not about loss. It's a way of respecting the reader's attention. And I'm sure if you've written any kind of academic book, even after the dissertation, you realize that there's a lot that can go. A lot needs to be subtracted. And this is what an editor might help you do if you're writing a crossover text, is what can be subtracted in this during this process. While we were looking at early drafts of Chris's book, for example, this came through not in the use of jargon necessarily, not in name dropping, but in the inclusion of some really difficult philosophical debates that he used to underpin some of the discussions that he was bringing up. And that would have been a great way to structure a class about the topic with undergrads or graduate students, but it would really have slowed down a general nonfiction reader who may not have understood those types of philosophical debate or even cared. Did he need it? In the end, he's able to simplify it. He was able to cut back on it. So in the same way, you should think about your text and what can actually be cut and the context remains for people to follow along. Many book projects begin with existing materials, dissertations, scholarly chapters, articles, or years of research written in academic forms or not even in notes. It's completely natural for those shapes to carry over into your crossover book manuscript drafts. But the problem is that most of those academic forms are designed to stand alone, like as standalone articles, chapters, journal articles and chapters in multi-author volumes. They each introduce their own framework. They restate their stakes. They conclude as if they're the only thing the reader is going to encounter. When these forms are placed side by side in a book for wider audiences, though, the result is repetition and stalled momentum. Dissertations intensify this problem even further. They're often written for an extremely small audience, sometimes only a handful of people, and for a very specific purpose: to demonstrate mastery and to satisfy your committee so that you can move on to the next stage of your academic career. I know most people don't do that at this point. Well, I mean, let's say maybe not in the US, but that's the whole idea, right? That you're going to advance into your assistant professor position. You're going to write your first book. So there's a whole sort of cadence to it. Because of that, many of the habits that we've already discussed, like defensive framing, exhaustive demonstration of your knowledge, delayed payoff, are oftentimes magnified in dissertations. And sometimes chapters are shaped to anticipate or even please a single member of your committee rather than guide a reader through an argument or a story. Editors who are working on trade-facing books help authors rethink chapters not as self-contained demonstrations, but as moments in a larger journey, each one doing something different for the reader and leaving them oriented and eager for what comes next. Our final barrier is voice. Voice loss often comes from that fear of sounding too simple or too confident or insufficiently qualified. Cue that nod to imposter syndrome that we've been talking about for so long. It even happens in the crossover field. In academic contexts, hedging and passive constructions are protective, and I've given you some examples of what those look like. They signal caution and awareness of some complexity, but for general readers, they can obscure who's speaking and why the reader should trust them. So they erode the reader's trust in your authority. Editors who are working on trade books often help authors reclaim a voice that's confident without being careless. So, again, clarity here isn't about certainty, it's about presence. The reader needs to feel that someone's guiding them through their text and that you are the scholar who can help them understand this topic to a greater depth. Here's where you can put that degree into some practical use. I know our parents were always saying, how are you going to practically use your degree? This is one of the ways you could potentially do that. Scholarly manuscripts establish a stake in the field. Crossover books guide readers through a compelling story. This distinction is the real pivot point here. Academic writing claims a place, but trade-facing books earn attention, and you have to earn it. It's not expected, and your reader is not expected, and they're not expected to read the entire book, but you want them to, and you have to keep their attention in order to do so. So, of course, I'm talking from this editorial perspective. I manage this team, and at Flatpage, we work with authors at many different stages in the development of their manuscripts. Sometimes we're brought in really late in the game when a manuscript is nearly finished and needs some careful line by line attention. Sometimes we're working on revisions after peer review or reader reports during the academic publishing process. And sometimes we're helping authors polish their prose if they're multilingual or not feeling confident or wanting to work with a new audience, wanting to reach a new audience. But the work that I've been describing here today, the work behind all these bullet points that I have up here on the slide, they mostly happen much earlier in the development of a manuscript. When you look at structural rethinking, this is about big picture questions. What kind of book is this? What's the organizing logic behind it? What does the reader need first and what can wait? These are decisions that shape the entire manuscript long before anyone is fixing sentences. Reader orientation means thinking deliberately about how a reader enters the book and moves through it. How are they introduced to the problem? How are they reminded of where they are? How are they guided when those ideas get really complex? Voice development isn't about tone polishing. Again, it's not line by line. It's about helping authors find a voice that can carry a reader through a long form argument or a story that remains confident and remains clear the entire time. And strategic omission may be the hardest part of all. Editors help authors decide what not to include. Killing your darlings, it's always so hard. Not because it isn't smart or well researched, but because it doesn't serve the reader in that moment of the book. It's not always necessary. Sometimes it can have a life of its own outside of the book or not at all. I recently saw a social media post where someone decided they were going to keep their darlings living by telling everybody what they had to cut out of the book. It was quite sweet, actually. So when we talk about editorial translation, here's that word translation again, we're not talking about fixing sentences. It's not an easy fix. We're talking about the conceptual work that happens while ideas are still taking shape, when the manuscript is becoming the book that it needs or you want it to be. So academic writing moves through forms that are designed to be complete in themselves. An article is meant to stand alone. A chapter in an edited volume is meant to stand alone. Even many academic books are written as a sequence of largely self-sufficient chapters, so they can be used by other scholars or students in a course. A trade-facing book works a bit differently. It's not a collection of complete units. It's a sustained experience over time. The reader is not encountering each chapter fresh. They're carrying memory, expectations, and questions as they move forward through a text, as they read the book, the entire book. That's the goal. We want them to read the entire book. This is why the shift from article to chapter to book is not just additive, it's about transforming the text. And when editors say they're thinking beyond that standalone unit, what they mean is that chapters no longer need to justify their existence independently. They don't need to reestablish the full context, restate the stakes from scratch, or rehearse everything that the reader already knows. Instead, each chapter has a distinct job within the bigger whole. One might orient the reader, another might deepen the question, another might complicate or challenge what's already been said. And the power of the book comes from that sequence, not from any single chapter proving its worth. So, this is also where attention becomes the governing principle. Editors are constantly asking themselves when they read your text, where is the reader's attention right now? What are they holding in mind from earlier in the chapter or from earlier in the book? And what questions live for them at this point in the book? So what are they thinking about? What questions do they have in mind? And are we answering those questions? And that's why repetition becomes such a problem in book manuscripts that are adapted from academic works. What reads as careful signposting in an academic context reads as stalling when the reader is already on the journey. We want to keep up the momentum. So when editors restructure books at this stage, we're not cutting for length or for taste. We're shaping an experience. We're deciding what belongs early, what can wait, and how ideas unfold across time so that the reader always feels supported and they always feel carried through the text at an appropriate cadence. Trade-facing intellectual books operate by a different set of priorities than academic ones. They don't need to establish disciplinary credibility because readers aren't evaluating your expertise when they read them. What they need instead is sustained intellectual curiosity, a sense that the ideas are worth following. They also depend on narrative momentum and reader trust. Readers need to feel oriented, carried forward, and confident that the book knows where it's going. If that trust breaks, even strong ideas can lose their force. You might lose credibility with your reader. Finally, these books require accuracy and integrity without relying on an academic apparatus. Seriousness comes from care with ideas and responsibility of the material, not from the number of citations you have or any other sort of formal scholarly conventions that you've been trained to use throughout your previous or even present life as an academic. When seen together as a whole, these are the conditions that allow intellectually ambitious books to work for general readers. And if you're still in the early stages of writing or shaping your text, you might consider these questions before you are even getting going or before you decide what to do with it. Who is your imagined reader? Again, I find it helpful to think of someone very specific. You might not, but that person should be intellectually curious. They don't necessarily have to have a PhD or even a master's or graduate degree. They're intellectually curious and they are wanting to read your book to learn more. What do they need to understand early in order to understand the text? And sometimes this is a lot different from what you're doing in academic writing, where you're already presuming that the reader, peer reviewer, already has background. Most of our intellectually curious readers don't necessarily have a background in these very specialist topics, as we all probably know. And what can be removed without loss? And sometimes this is the hardest part for us as writers, for sure. I can understand it. Readiness isn't a binary. It doesn't mean that you're either ready or not. And many projects become ready as a state of being through editorial conversation, reader feedback, and many, many drafts. So you can always get feedback on your draft as you're working forward. And when you're thinking about editorial collaboration, editors are really helpful when scholarly writers are thinking about these kinds of crossover books, thinking about transitioning from academic forms, or if they're feeling stuck between different audiences with their text. These are some of the ways that you might engage somebody outside of your manuscript or your colleagues if you don't feel like sharing your text with them. Book coaches might be helpful as you conceptualize your project and plan the writing process. They can also look over drafts and help you establish the direction of your writing. Developmental editors look at fully written manuscripts and they provide feedback on the overall argumentation, organization, your use of evidence to support, and your overall voice throughout the text. And finally, when you already have a draft going, line editing is perhaps the last stage. That's when you're really invested in cleaning up any remaining jargon, rewriting sentences at the line level. You really want the language to be understood by your new audience. All of this work is strategic. It's not looking necessarily at where a comma is in the text. It's not that mechanical. It's thinking about how to shape your text from the ground up. Of course, this entire process requires a lot of craft, a lot of intentionality. It requires different instincts than perhaps we were trained to use as academics, different structures, and oftentimes different partners than what you might be used to from your academic training. So if you're thinking about a book like this, or if you already have one in the pipeline, you're considering editorial collaboration, we're happy to talk to you. We're also happy to talk to you about any manuscripts that you might be wanting to publish because, of course, Flatpage is publishing intellectually rigorous books of the kind that we've been talking about throughout today's presentation. So thank you so much. We're at about half an hour right now. I'm happy to take some questions. Maybe we'll turn over to Ben and see if there's been any questions in the Q&A. And if not, and if you haven't posed your question yet, feel free to pitch them now into the chat or send them directly to Ben.
Thank you, Kara. We have a few questions we can get started with as some more trickle in, hopefully. The first one we've got here is whether can you say a little bit more about how you would choose between developmental editing and coaching if you were approaching the task of transforming an academic text into something for general audiences?
Yeah, so I think the difference really comes with whether or not you have an actual manuscript at hand, or if you're still in the early stages, or if you haven't written anything yet. Sure, if you haven't written anything yet, you just have an idea and you need someone to bounce ideas off of and to really, you know, help you plan out the book from the table of contents to even your writing schedule, and how to use the resources that you have at hand. A book coach can really do that. And they're more of a bespoke service that you are going to meet with them at a regular cadence and talk to them about your project. You might send them texts along the way if you're writing things to make sure that you're on track, but they're not necessarily going to read the entire manuscript itself. When you get to the point where you actually have a manuscript at hand, something written down, even starting with a chapter, that goes to a developmental editor who gives you more targeted feedback on the actual writing itself. And they're looking at a few different specific categories that I mentioned. So they're looking at your overall argument and how you tell a story about that argument. They're looking at the structure of your chapters, of how those chapters fit within that narrative arc that we talked about. They're looking at your use of evidence and whether or not maybe you still have some of those signposts from the earlier academic draft where you have too many names dropped in there that are not necessary. And they're also looking at your overall voice. They're not necessarily correcting it at this point. They're giving you feedback about how you can shape the manuscript. So a lot of times that takes the form of like an editorial or author's report or letter that they send to you, and they help you with the ways, or they give you advice, basically suggestions about how you might do that.
Great, thank you. We have another question. This is an interesting one. Um, how do you determine when feedback from academic peers is identifying a genuine issue, and when is it because of misunderstanding your book's goals? There's a quick example here. The person who asked this question, their first attempt at a wider audience book recently received a lengthy review in a top journal, but it only engaged with the framing and not really the content at all, and lambasted it as philosophy disguised as self-help. The author probably could have been more precise in some of their framing, but also wonders if the reviewer wouldn't have been satisfied unless they wrote in a more academic register to begin with.
I mean, it sounds like classic reviewer number two behavior to me. It sounds like this person who wrote the review wanted to be the peer reviewer rather than taking this book as a trade book. I mean, there's problems with that for multiple different reasons. This is a specialist reader who's reading your book as a specialist reader, and they're not reading it because they're, a trade reader. They're not a general reader. So a lot of the things that a general reader would need in that kind of text are there for those readers. They're not there for specialists. So I think it's really about that reader's expectations of a book that weren't met, not, I mean, I haven't read the book, I don't know, but about that rather than the actual contents of the book. I mean, that it's so tough because, usually academic journals will review other academic books and talk about the academic merits of it. That's the whole thing. It's, having reviews in those journals helps you sell your academic book to other specialists, right? Form of marketing for your book. Um, those kinds of reviews are not really that useful for a trade-oriented book, because those are, the review is not for the intended audience or person who's buying that book. Um, so, I mean, I guess that also gets to another issue that often is asked. Maybe I'll ask myself a question. When we're looking at text to publish at Flatpage, we're oftentimes asked, because we work with so many academic authors, whether or not these kinds of books go through peer review. And for a lot of the reasons that I've just described, we don't do peer review. I mean, we're not a university press, and trade presses are not. They don't have a stable of people to pick from on their editorial board, or subscribers to ask to be peer reviewers. Of course, as we all know, coming from an academic background, you need to compensate those people somehow. And besides that, your book is not oriented towards other specialists. So having a peer reviewer is a way to get that kind of feedback that this author has received through this review in the journal. You're not looking for that person's approval. You're looking for intellectually, again, curious readers who want to learn something more about your topic, or they want to get some practical advice or something like this that you've gleaned from your many years of research and doing training in this field. And that's just not, it's a totally different audience.
Great, thank you. Another question. Do you have any advice around deciding which technical terms should be simplified and which need to be preserved to avoid losing accuracy when working with a specialized text?
Yeah, I think that this gets a lot to, discipline specific expectations. And part of the reason why I was more general and perhaps more abstract with this presentation is that, every type of book is going to have its own needs. Of course, if you're writing something that's, more towards the STEM side, you're going to have to do different types of massages of the text, so to speak, than somebody who's doing history, which might be a more accepted or popular form of trade book. Not to say that science, I guess, isn't, but you might be more used to the conventions, so to speak, of writing a longer narrative than somebody who's coming from a STEM background. Um, so I think in terms of the use of jargon, sometimes it is appropriate as long as you're explaining what those terms mean. If it's not something that is going to trip the reader up, or, like really that question of is it necessary? or not is something that you should always be asking yourself. So that's why it's good to have some sort of outside reader. Sometimes it's called like beta reader. In the fiction world, you can hire somebody called a beta reader to actually read your text for you and give you feedback about their position as a reader. But you want that kind of feedback from another non-specialist or somebody who's not looking at your text from that sort of peer reviewer type perspective, who can tell you whether or not an area of your text or certain words are not understandable for a reader that's outside of your audience. I know that's not specific, but again, every field has its own different types of language and jargon and conventions that it would be impossible for me to cover which ones are appropriate and which not.